Hello, I'm Richard Orme. This presentation is part of a series by UCAF, the UK Association for Accessible Formats. The presentations introduce accessible formats, including Braille, large print, audio, EPUB, Office documents, and PDF. I serve on the board of UCAF, but my day job is with the DAISY Consortium, an international non-profit organisation working to improve access to information for people with print disabilities. In that role, I work with disability organisations, accessibility experts, education organisations, technology companies and publishers. And a lot of our work is focused on technologies for accessible publications and curriculum materials. This presentation is all about EPUB, the format developed by the publishing industry for ebooks and other digital publications. And during this presentation, I'll be covering the following topics. What is EPUB and what's happening with EPUB standards? What resources are there for learning about EPUB and what important developments are happening with EPUB? There'll be a demonstration of EPUB, working together with assistive technology. We'll cover some case studies, and you'll learn how you can take the next step with EPUB. So, what is EPUB? Well, disability organisations have been making digital books actually since the late 80s. But mainstream digital ebooks hit in the early 2000s. And in developing the new standards for this industry, it was a collaboration between the publishers, the technology sector, and the disability community all working together. Publishers, well, they wanted a single file that they could distribute into the different distribution networks. They didn't want to have to produce different versions of a publication for lots of the different distribution channels. The technology companies, well, they needed content that would display well on any device that they made. So whether that's a desktop computer, a laptop computer, a tablet, or a smartphone. And the disability community wanted to make sure that these new digital publications were accessible to them. People who were blind wanted to be able to use their screen readers. People with low vision wanted to be able to enlarge the characters and adjust the visual representation. And people with learning differences, such as dyslexia, well, they benefit from being able to choose the colours, personalise the font and spacing, and to have highlighting while hearing the text read to them. And EPUB is for accessible content. EPUB's based on the technologies of the open web platform, technologies such as HTML and cascading style sheets. And these technologies have accessibility features in there, and these are inherited in the EPUB format. So this provides, for example, scalable fonts and reflow. So just as we're used to modern websites being responsive to smaller screens, EPUB will work on all size screens without the need to pan and zoom left and right in order to see the full width of the line. It also provides the ability to change the foreground and background colours, the margins and line spacing, and to choose a preferred font and adjust the font size. And for people using a screen reader, well, if they have familiar commands they're used to using the web, so for example, the ability to be able to jump between headings, to navigate around a table, to read the alt text, to escape from a list, these same commands will work within an EPUB because it is just web type content. And because EPUB has been designed for publications from the ground up, it provides excellent navigation features, even for the most complex titles. So it provides, for example, a table of contents, print page navigation, the ability to use hyperlinks to jump around within a publication, and to endnotes. It provides for bookmarking, search, and more. And an important thing to think about here is that EPUBs are not made accessible after the fact. The standard itself has accessibility kind of baked in. So when an book is born digital, it can be born accessible. So where are we in EPUB in 2020, the year I'm making this presentation? Well, the publishing industry has embraced EPUB as their bedrock of digital book publishing all around the world. It's an international format for all sorts of languages and scripts. And if we think about consumer ebooks, so novels, the bestseller list, and so on, nearly 100% of these consumer ebooks are made as EPUB. If you're reading ebook through a ebook store, the chances are those ebooks are made from EPUB. EPUB has also made great inroads into higher education with its ability to contain images and tables, complex content such as maths and so on. So in the States, it's said that some 80% of newer higher education textbooks are produced in EPUB 3. Now, lots of content in education is available on websites. So, for example, you might have a journal database and the ability to read journal articles as HTML. But what if you want to download that article and keep it on your hard drive and read it sometime later when you're offline? Well, HTML isn't such a great offline format, but EPUB packages up that HTML and provides it in a navigable format. So increasingly, you'll see EPUB is being offered as the download format for HTML content such as journal articles. And as well as published books, you'll see publications coming from government and non-governmental organizations where they're producing maybe a brochure or a big report or something like that. EPUB will be one of the options that is offered. So let's talk about the EPUB standards. Well, EPUB was developed by an organization previously called the International Digital Publishers Forum, IDPF. But in fact, the work's now been taken under the wing of W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, the organization responsible for the standards of the web. The current version of EPUB is 3.2, and this was the approved recommendation dating back to May 2019. So it's stable and it's up to date. And part of that recommendation is the statement that an EPUB should conform to the EPUB accessibility specification, which sets out the minimum requirements for what makes an accessible EPUB. So, for example, the HTML conforming to WCAG standards, it containing accessibility metadata, and some other properties too. EPUB is well on the way to becoming an ISO standard. We expect that to be happening really quite soon. So let's talk about some important developments that are happening right now with EPUB, and I wanted to call out three. First is, I mentioned on the last slide that accessible EPUB can contain metadata on accessibility. What does this mean? It means that before you even download an EPUB, you're able to discover the accessibility properties of that digital publication. So does it, for example, have described images? Does it contain accessible math? Are there accessibility hazards in there? And this type of accessibility metadata is now displayed on some ebook platforms where you would look to buy or borrow ebooks. But what has been discovered is that displaying the metadata isn't so friendly. So a user experience guide is being developed for the makers of these platforms in how to interpret the metadata and display it in a human-friendly form. So that's the user experience guide for displaying accessibility metadata. So if, for example, you're interested in looking for an EPUB that is screen reader friendly, that should be really obvious to you when you find the title. Next thing I want to mention is mathematics, and maths expressions have been something that have been a real challenge for accessibility for, well, time immemorial. Well, now there are various techniques that can be used for including math within an EPUB, and having conducted extensive testing with the reading systems and with the assistive technology, there are now some recommendations for publishers and people who make EPUB as to how to include mathematics within a publication. And we're all familiar with the concept of alt text, where a short bit of text can describe the intention of an image included on a web page or in a publication, but sometimes that's just not enough. So now there are some recommendations for best practices for including extended descriptions. So let's take a look at EPUB in action. We'll take a look at a couple of EPUBs, and we'll use an app on Windows, which is free. It's called Thorium Reader. And we'll start by looking at visual adjustments that might be useful for someone with low vision or with a reading difference such as dyslexia. And then after that, we'll look at reading the EPUB in Thorium Reader using the free Windows screen reader called NVDA. I'll start the Thorium Reader by clicking on the icon on my desktop. And the app starts in the library view where the publications I have already added are displayed for me. To keep things simple, I'll pick the first one in the list so I can get reading. Okay, let's go into settings to see what options I have for changing the colours. The first option is called Theme, where I can choose between neutral, black text on white, sepia, for a low contrast, low glare option, and night, high contrast with white text on a black background. Next, well, this text is pretty small, so let's increase it. We do this through the next option in the settings menu under text. Here there's a slider, and as we move it, the text size changes dynamically, so we know when we've got to the level we're happy with. As you would expect, the page display adjusts to the new size, so that the text neatly reflows to fit in the width of the window. Next, let's look at the fonts available to us. Here they are, just under text size, and we have 8 options. This includes the default font for the ebook, a choice of serif and sans serif fonts, and a dyslexia-specific font which is called Readable. Options for spacing are helpful in that these enable someone to personalize the presentation of the text on the display. Thorium Reader has plenty of options for spacing control, so the line length can be shortened by increasing the margin. The spacing between the lines can be increased and even adjusted between words and individual letters, so that's pretty comprehensive. We also have control over whether we want to override the publisher settings for justification and whether we want 1 or 2 columns of text shown on the display, so that's nice to see. Okay, so having looked at the visual adjustments that are available within a typical EPUB reader, let's now look at the screen reading experience. Okay, let's start reading this book.
Down arrow. Heading Level 1 Worst Ocean Disaster in World's History. Titanic goes down. 1,341 lives are lost.
So it read me this heading and it told me it was heading level 1. Let's keep reading.
Down arrow. Graphic painting of a ship sinking by the bow, with people rowing a lifeboat in the foreground and other. Down arrow. Graphic people in the water. Icebergs are visible in the background.
So here it told me that it had reached a graphic, and then it read to me the alt text, the description of what this painting is about. The person that created this publication has entered the alt text to describe each image. Let's keep reading.
Down arrow. Untergang der Titanic. Sinking of the Titanic, by Willie Stower, 1912.
It's read me the caption of this painting, and maybe you noticed, the caption is actually German, and it switched to the German voice before continuing in the English voice. I'm keeping reading with down arrow.
Down arrow. Heading level 2 background.
So I'm going to press H and it'll read me the next heading and move to that spot in the book.
Starting out heading level 2. The 14th of April, 1912 heading level 2. Iceberg warnings, heading level 3. Iceberg, right ahead. 2339, heading level 3.
So as I keep pressing H, it's moving me from heading to heading.
Effects of the collision heading level 3. The 15th of April, 1912 heading level 2.
Now it's telling me the heading level each time it reaches it. I can also use the number keys to move to the previous or next heading of that level. So 2 will move me to the next heading level 2, Shift 2 will move me to the previous heading level 2, and 1 will move me to the next heading level 1, and Shift 1 will move me to the previous heading level 1. So I'm going to see if I can find the next heading level 3.
Preparing to evacuate heading level 3. Departure of the lifeboats, 00:4502:05, heading level 3.
Now if the book is organized using hierarchical heading structures, this makes it very powerful for moving through the content. So that's the keystroke to move heading by heading. There are other ways of moving through as well. So G will move me to the next graphic.
Photograph of a bearded man wearing a white captain's uniform, standing on a ship with his arms crossed.
And I'm going to move to the next graphic.
Illustration of a weeping woman being comforted by a man on the sloping deck of a ship. In the background, men are loading other women into a lifeboat. Graphic.
And I can move between links with K.
http://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/sinking of the RMS Titanic number site ref ship time 10 link.
The L key will move me to a list.
List with 3 items bullet. Down arrow. Less than a third of those aboard Titanic survived the disaster.
And as I moved into the list, it told me I was in a list and how many items are there. Once in a list, I can move between the items with I and Shift I. That moves me through item by item.
Bullet, some survivors died shortly afterwards.
Now, if I'm in a really long list, the comma key will jump me out of a list and carry on reading.
Of the groups shown in the table, 49% of the children, 26% of the female passengers, 82% of the...
Let's do some reading of a table. So I'm going to use T to move to a table.
With 9 rows
And once in the table, I can use my screen reader commands to move around the table and also to read out the column or row header. So that's about the standard and the technology, but let's think about where EPUB is actually being used. Well, I mentioned before that EPUB is used extensively in higher education, and on the screen here I'm calling out the names of some publishers who produce textbooks for university level education. So this includes Macmillan Learning, W.W. Norton, Kogan Page, Pearson and Wiley. And the reason why I'm mentioning these is that these companies all submitted titles to something that's called the Publishers Face-Off, where their titles of a recently produced book are examined by accessibility experts and people with reading disabilities, and they get feedback on how they've done and whether they've included all the features that people would want. It has been amazing, the quality of content that's been provided to this Publisher Face-Off scheme. And the standard of entries has been really, really high. And the publishers are not choosing the simple titles. They're submitting textbooks in fields of physics and mathematics and biology and so on. And it's amazing the work that they're building into ebooks so that when they reach any student, they've got the accessibility already built in. And I mentioned that the publishers wanted a single file format to go into different channels. On this screen, I'm demonstrating how one publisher talked about how their ebooks are sent to multiple platforms. So this includes regular ebook platforms that a consumer might use, such as Kobo, Apple Books, Google Books, or Kindle, but also the more education-focused platforms such as eBook Central, VitalSource Bookshelf, RedShelf and EBSCO. And lastly, interesting that these ebooks are also making their way to the specialist distributors for people with print disabilities. So in the US, for example, the Access Text Network and Bookshare, and in the UK, RNIB Bookshare. So what about some resources for learning about EPUB? Well, actually, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to suggest that you go along to the website inclusivepublishing.org, which is a definitive resource for people from various sectors, including publishing, the developers of reading apps, people from the education sector and end users. And it includes all sorts of wonderful content, such as the guidelines and standards, the tools that can be used to validate content, the testing of reading apps. There's news from the industry, information about upcoming events, and articles, videos, tutorials, and more. So if you go along to that website, you can read the content that's posted there at the moment, and you can sign up for updates. And if you want to take a next step with EPUB, well, if you're a publisher, I'd really encourage you to join the Publishers Association Accessibility Action Group. This is a group of like-minded folk from the publishing industry and from disability organisations and from the education world, working together to drive accessible publishing and reading in the UK forwards. If you want to make your own EPUB, well, the simplest way is to create a structured document within Google Docs, make sure it's got headings and alt text on the images, and then simply do download as EPUB. If you want to use Microsoft Word, then grab the free Word to EPUB tool from the DAISY website, make yourself a structured Word document, and then create a wonderful EPUB, which you can then try out using different reading experiences. If you have an iPhone or iPad or Mac, you can use Apple Books. So if you have an EPUB and just click on it, that will open in that app. It's built into the ships with the operating system. Similarly, if you're using Android, and you get an EPUB, then it will open in Google Books. If you're using a desktop computer, why not download a copy of Thorium Reader, which you can use on the Mac and on Windows, and see how you get along with that. Thanks for listening to the presentation. I hope you found this and the other introduction presentations from UCAF to be useful.